If you've ever flown budget airlines in Europe, you know Ryanair. The bright blue and yellow livery, the no-frills service, and those famously packed flights where every seat was taken. But something's changed. I recently booked a flight from London Stansted to Dublin, and when I boarded, I couldn't believe what I saw. Rows and rows of empty seats. This wasn't a random Tuesday morning flight either. This was a Friday afternoon, traditionally one of the busiest times to fly. Ryanair built its entire business model on volume. Pack the planes, fly them constantly, keep prices rock bottom, and make money on extras. For years, it worked perfectly. They became Europe's largest airline by passenger numbers, carrying over 168 million people in 2019. The planes were always full. You'd be squeezed in with barely any legroom, but hey, you paid £9.99 for a flight to Spain. Now, when you walk through airports like Stansted, Luton, or Dublin, you can see the difference. The Ryanair gates aren't as crowded anymore. The boarding queues are shorter, and once you're on the plane, there's actual space. At first, you might think this is great. More room, easier boarding, less chaos. But for an airline that depends on filling every single seat to make a profit, empty planes are a disaster. What's really going on here? Why are people suddenly avoiding Ryanair? Is it the fees, the service, or has something bigger shifted in how people want to travel? Over the years, Ryanair became famous not just for cheap flights, but for being, well, difficult, and it seems like passengers have finally had enough. The cracks were always there, but now they're impossible to ignore. Let's talk about what it actually costs to fly Ryanair these days. You see a fare advertised for £15, and you think, brilliant, cheap flight sorted, but then you start the booking process, and the price keeps climbing. Want to bring a cabin bag that's bigger than a handbag? That's £15 to £30 extra depending on the route. Want to pick your seat? Another £5 to £20. Need to check a bag? Add £25 to £50 more. By the time you've added everything you need for a normal trip, that $15 per flight is now £80 or £90. And here's the thing, at that price point, you're competing with EasyJet, Wizz Air, and sometimes even British Airways on sale. The difference is, those other airlines don't make you feel like you're being nickel and dimed at every step. Ryanair introduced priority boarding as a paid extra years ago. Then they changed their cabin baggage policy multiple times. First, you could bring 2 bags for free. Then it was 1 bag plus a small personal item. Now, unless you pay extra, you're limited to a bag that fits under the seat in front of you. If your bag is even slightly too big at the gate, they'll charge you £50 or more to check it. People got tired of it. The constant rule changes, the surprise fees, the feeling that the airline is actively trying to trick you into paying more. There are entire forums and social media groups dedicated to helping people avoid Ryanair fees. When customers need a survival guide just to book a flight, something's gone wrong. What used to feel like a clever hack, finding those ultra-cheap fares, now feels like a gamble. Will they change the rules again? Will I get caught out at the gate? It's exhausting, and travelers are choosing airlines where the price you see is closer to what you actually pay. Ryanair's customer service reputation is legendary, and not in a good way. For years, the airline's CEO, Michael O'Leary, was famous for his combative style and his dismissive attitude toward customer complaints. He once suggested charging people to use the toilet on flights. He called passengers stupid for not reading the terms and conditions. That attitude filtered down through the entire company. When COVID hit and thousands of flights were canceled, Ryanair's customer service completely collapsed. People waited months for refunds that they were legally entitled to within days. Phone lines were constantly engaged. Emails went unanswered. The airline was eventually taken to court multiple times across Europe for failing to process refunds. I spoke to several people while researching this video, and the stories were remarkably similar. One woman told me she waited 7 months for a £240 refund after her flight was canceled. She called dozens of times, sent countless emails, and eventually had to threaten legal action before Ryanair finally paid up. Another passenger missed a connection due to a delayed Ryanair flight and was told it wasn't the airline's responsibility, even though EU regulations clearly state otherwise. The problem isn't just that things go wrong. Things go wrong with every airline. The problem is how Ryanair handles it when they do. There's no empathy, no flexibility, and often no real help at all. You're just pointed to the website or told to fill out a form that might never get answered. Compare that to airlines like Jet2 or even EasyJet, where customer service teams actually try to resolve issues. People remember how they're treated when things go wrong. And after being burned once by Ryanair, many passengers simply refuse to fly with them again. Word spreads fast, especially on social media, where Ryanair horror stories go viral regularly. London Stansted Airport is Ryanair's biggest base in the UK. It's where the airline operates the most flights, and for years it was the go-to airport for cheap European getaways. But Stansted isn't convenient for most Londoners. It's about 40 miles northeast of central London, and getting there is a journey in itself. The Stansted Express train costs around £19 each way. If you book in advance, more if you buy on the day. National Express coaches are cheaper, but can take well over an hour depending on traffic. If you're driving, parking costs add up quickly, and the M11 motorway can be a nightmare during rush hour. By the time you factor in travel time and costs to get to Stansted, that cheap Ryanair flight starts looking a lot less appealing. Meanwhile, EasyJet operates heavily from Gatwick and Luton, both of which have better transport links. British Airways obviously flies from Heathrow, which is connected to the London Underground. Even London City Airport, despite being small, is incredibly convenient for anyone living in East London. Stansted just doesn't compete on location. I visited Stansted recently on a Saturday morning, traditionally one of the busiest times. The Ryanair check-in area was noticeably quieter than I remembered from previous trips. There were still plenty of passengers, but not the chaotic crowds you'd expect. Staff told me off the record that loads have been down, especially on midweek flights. Ryanair chose Stansted because it was cheap to operate from, not because it was convenient for passengers. That strategy worked when flights were £5, and people would travel anywhere for a deal. But as fares have crept up and other airlines have improved, the inconvenience of Stansted has become a real barrier. People are willing to pay a bit more to fly from an airport they can actually get to easily. While Ryanair was busy adding fees and cutting corners, other airlines were quietly improving. EasyJet, often lumped together with Ryanair as just another budget carrier, has actually positioned itself as the more customer-friendly option. They have better seat pitch, more reasonable baggage policies, and a customer service team that doesn't treat passengers like adversaries. Then there's Jet2, which has grown massively in recent years. They fly from regional airports across the UK, their fares are transparent, and they've built a reputation for actually caring about passengers. When flights are delayed, Jet2 provides updates and compensation without you having to fight for it. Their customer satisfaction ratings are consistently high, the complete opposite of Ryanair. Even Wizz Air, another ultra-low-cost carrier, has started to look more appealing by comparison. Yes, they're also cheap and basic, but their fees are more predictable and they've been expanding rapidly into routes. Ryanair used to dominate. British Airways has also entered the game with their basic economy fares. You get a full-service airline reputation with a no-frills price. The baggage allowance is clearer, there's assigned seating, and if something goes wrong, you're dealing with BA's customer service instead of Ryanair's. For many travelers, especially those flying for business, that peace of mind is worth the extra £20 or £30. The market has changed. Budget travel no longer means you have to accept a terrible service. There are now multiple airlines offering cheap fares without the hostility and hidden costs. Ryanair pioneered low-cost flying in Europe, but they've been so focused on being the absolute cheapest that they forgot passengers actually have choices. And increasingly, they're choosing to fly with someone else. COVID changed how people think about travel. During lockdowns, people realized they didn't need to take as many weekend city breaks. When travel returned, priorities shifted. Instead of 4 or 5 short, cheap trips a year, people started taking fewer but longer, more meaningful holidays. This shift hurt Ryanair badly. Their business model depends on high-frequency short-haul flights. The weekend in Barcelona crowd, the stag-do to Prague crowd, the quick visits to see family abroad. When people started prioritizing quality over quantity, suddenly those rock-bottom fares weren't as appealing. There's also been a change in how people view their time. Spending 3 hours getting to Stansted, arriving 2 hours before a flight, flying for 2 hours, then navigating local transport at the other end, all to save £50 compared to a more convenient option, doesn't seem worth it anymore. Time became more valuable post-pandemic. Working from home normalized remote work, which means people can now take longer trips and work from anywhere. Why squeeze into a Ryanair seat for a frantic weekend when you could take a week somewhere, fly comfortably, and actually relax? The math changed? I noticed this shift myself. Before COVID, I'd book random cheap Ryanair flights just because they were cheap. A Tuesday to Thursday in Copenhagen for £30 return? Why not? But now I think about the full experience, the airport hassle, the uncomfortable flight, the stress of whether my bag will fit. Often I'd rather just not go or pay more for a better experience. Environmental awareness also increased during the pandemic. People became more conscious of their carbon footprint, and frequent short-haul flights are a big contributor. Ryanair's entire model encourages unnecessary flying. Those bargain fares make flying feel disposable, like taking a bus. Some travelers are now actively avoiding that mindset. Ryanair operates over 2,500 routes across Europe, and honestly, some of them make absolutely no sense. They'll fly to obscure airports an hour outside the actual city, market it as flying to that city, and leave passengers stranded trying to figure out local transport. Take Ryanair's Frankfurt route. They don't fly to Frankfurt Airport, they fly to Frankfurt-Hahn, which is 120 kilometers away, closer to Luxembourg than Frankfurt. The bus transfer takes over 2 hours. Same story with their Barcelona flights that land in Girona, or Stockholm flights to Skavsta. You think you're booking a convenient city break, then realize you're landing in the middle of nowhere. This worked when people didn't know better, or when the savings were so massive it didn't matter. But in 2005, everyone has Google Maps. Everyone can see exactly where these airports are, and increasingly people are choosing to pay a bit more to actually land near their destination. I booked a flight to Paris with Ryanair once. It landed at Beauvais, which is about 85 kilometers north of Paris. The airport is tiny, the shuttle bus was an extra 17 each way, and it took 90 minutes to get into the city. By the time I factored in the bus fare and the wasted time, I could have just flown EasyJet to Charles de Gaulle and taken the train directly into central Paris. Regional UK airports have also become problematic for Ryanair. They expanded aggressively into places like Doncaster, Sheffield, and Bournemouth, promising connectivity and growth. Then they'd suddenly pull out with little notice, leaving local passengers without options and local councils who'd invested in infrastructure feeling betrayed. That kind of behavior damages trust, not just with passengers, but with entire communities. Ryanair isn't stupid. They can see the empty seats, they can read the customer reviews, and they know something needs to change. Michael O'Leary has started talking about improving the customer experience, which, coming from him, is remarkable. They've launched a Always Getting Better program, promising fewer fees, better service, and more transparency. Some changes have actually happened. The website is slightly easier to use now. The mobile app has improved. They've relaxed some baggage rules, though they still change frequently enough to confuse people. There's even been talk of introducing business class on some routes, which seems bizarre for an airline that built its brand on being aggressively no frills. The problem is, reputation takes years to build and moments to destroy. Ryanair spent decades cultivating an image of not caring about passengers. You can't undo that with a marketing campaign and a few minor policy tweaks. Trust has to be earned back slowly, and many passengers have simply moved on. They're also facing practical challenges. Fuel costs have increased significantly since 2022. Airport charges are going up. Staff wages have risen due to strikes and union pressure. All of this eats into the razor-thin margins that budget airlines operate on. Ryanair's model only works at scale, with full planes. Half-empty flights lose money fast. Competition is fiercer than ever, not just from other airlines but from alternative transport. High-speed rail is expanding across Europe. It's often more convenient than flying for shorter routes. Why fly Ryanair from London to Paris when the Eurostar gets you city center to city center in 2 hours with no airport hassle? There's also the fleet issue. Ryanair operates one of the youngest fleets in Europe, mostly Boeing 737s. That's efficient for maintenance and training, but it also means they're locked into a single manufacturer. Any Boeing issues, and Ryanair's growth plans stall. So where does Ryanair go from here? The truth is they're too big to fail, but too damaged to thrive the way they once did. They'll keep flying. They'll still carry millions of passengers, but the days of absolute dominance are probably over. The airline industry is cyclical. Airlines rise and fall based on fuel prices, economic conditions, and passenger preferences. Ryanair was perfectly positioned for the 2000s and 2010s, when cheap travel was new and exciting, and passengers were willing to tolerate poor service for low prices. That era is ending. We're seeing a bifurcation in the market. At the top, premium airlines are thriving because people will pay for quality. At the bottom, true ultra-low-cost carriers like Wizz Air are competing on price alone. Ryanair is stuck in the middle, too expensive to be the absolute cheapest, but too basic to justify the cost against better alternatives. The empty seats I saw on my recent flights aren't a temporary blip. They're a sign that the market has moved on. Passengers want transparency, they want decent service, and they want to be treated like customers, not the cattle. Ryanair trained an entire generation to expect terrible service in exchange for cheap fares, and now that generation is choosing differently. I think what's really interesting is watching how younger travelers approach Ryanair. Gen Z didn't grow up in the era when any cheap flight was magical. They've always had options. They read reviews, they check TikTok for travel horror stories, and they're way more likely to pay extra for a better experience. The brand loyalty that Ryanair never bothered to build, it's really showing now. There's also the environmental angle that's only going to get stronger. The EU is tightening regulations on aviation emissions. Ticket prices will likely include carbon costs in the future. When that happens, the gap between Ryanair and slightly more expensive alternatives will narrow even further. If you're paying an extra £15 in carbon taxes regardless of which airline you choose, suddenly that £10 difference in base fare doesn't seem so important. Looking at their financial reports, Ryanair is still profitable, but the margins are tightening. They reported load factors, that's the percentage of seats filled, dropping from the high 90s to the low to mid 80s on many routes. That might not sound dramatic, but for an airline that needs 95% load factors to hit their profit targets, it's a serious problem. They can't just keep adding more routes when they can't fill the planes they already have. Then there's the question of airports. Many of the secondary airports Ryanair depends on are struggling too. Some have closed, others have reduced operations. Ryanair's strategy of using cheap out-of-the-way airports only works if those airports can stay open and maintain reasonable transport links. As passenger numbers drop, some of these airports become unsustainable, which creates a vicious cycle. There's a lesson here about short-term thinking. Ryanair optimized for immediate profit at the expense of long-term loyalty. Every hidden fee, every rude interaction, every policy change designed to extract more money, it all added up. Customers have long memories, especially when they feel they've been tricked or disrespected. Will Ryanair adapt? Maybe. O'Leary is nothing if not pragmatic, but changing a corporate culture that's been built on confrontation and cost-cutting above all else takes more than press releases and marketing campaigns. It requires fundamental changes to how the airline operates, how it treats customers, and how it thinks about value beyond just the lowest possible price. For now, those empty seats tell the story better than any earnings report. The market has spoken, and what it's saying is clear. Cheap isn't enough anymore. People want their money's worth, they want to be treated with respect, and they have plenty of other options. Ryanair bet everything on price, and that bet isn't paying off the way it used to. Thank you for watching. If you've got your own